Welcome, everyone, to this POMED TIMEP co-hosted event ahead of the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, examining Egypt's record on anti-corruption and women's rights. I'm Tess McEnery, the new executive director of POMED, and I am thrilled to join our co-host TIMEP, all of the panelists here today, and everyone tuning in from around the globe to champion democracy and human rights in Egypt. I also want to wish everyone a happy International Anti-Corruption Day. Our collective vision here today is clear-eyed. Democratic development and respect for human rights is vital for the peace, prosperity, and progress of not just Egypt, but the region and the globe. Just take a look at the Egyptian regime's choking of civic space before and during the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP27. There can be no effective climate action without the critical voices of civil society. And yet, one of the most repressive governments on earth turned the screws even tighter, refusing to release activist Abdel Fattah despite international demands, and arresting about 1,000 Egyptians in the weeks leading up to COP. We are holding this event today precisely to shine a light on the repression and abuses carried out by the Egyptian regime as its leaders head to Washington, D.C. for next week's U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. This summit is being hosted by the White House, which describes one of the gathering's objectives as reinforcing commitments to democracy, human rights, and civil society. And yet, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has been invited and is expected to attend, a dictator whose recent greenwashing of abuses during COP27 is just the latest entry in a false narrative about Egypt's human rights progress. With al-Sisi's possible presence, it's all the more important that we convene today to shed light on the facts, on the truth of what it means to demand government accountability and human rights in Egypt. We are hosting today's event in support of civil society's participation around the margins of this U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. In fact, the December 13th Civil Society Forum before the summit will focus on anti-corruption and the role of marginalized communities, including women's rights. We know that the Egyptian regime puts out a very rosy picture on these issues and its broader human rights record, as al-Sisi did at this November meeting with President Joe Biden at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Unfortunately, we all know the reality in Egypt is much darker, with major challenges on corruption and women's rights. So we wanted to hold today's event to offer civil society's perspectives on these crucial issues. The importance of these topics is clear. Warning signs about Egypt's failing economy and corrupt government institutions are increasing by the day. The deeply dysfunctional construction of a new capital city, currency devaluations, and inflation threaten the country's stability. And this corruption of the state cannot be separated from the persecution, prosecution, and public shaming of Egyptian women. As feminist movements become more vocal and demand more progress, including an end to endemic sexual violence, the regime simply cracks down more and more on women's autonomy. These issues are deeply meaningful and urgent for the people of Egypt, and they should also be for the United States government, which invests billions of dollars into supporting Egypt's government in an elusive quest for regional stability. So it is with immense gratitude and excitement that we launched today's event with the voices of dedicated democracy and human rights advocates. First, we will hear remarks from U.S. Representative Gregory Meeks, a Democrat of New York, who is the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and an important leader on these issues. We applaud Representative Meeks for calling on the administration to reprogram $300 million in foreign military financing to Egypt, conditioned on human rights. Then we will turn the event over to TIMEP's executive director, Rami Yacoub, who will moderate a discussion on corruption and women's rights in Egypt with panelists Lobna Darwish and Tim Caldas. So now, without further ado, I am pleased to share a video message by Representative Meeks.
Good morning, and thank you, Project on Middle East Democracy and the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy for hosting this important discussion. As chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I seek to ensure our nation's foreign policy pursues our national interests while also staying true to our democratic values. I value the deep, historic United States-Egypt relationship and the important role Egypt plays in the region, particularly with Israel and Palestine, as well as on the continent of Africa. Our ties run deep, including deep people-to-people ties. New York City, my hometown, is proud to be the metropolitan area with the largest number of Egyptian Americans in the United States. And as I reflect on our bilateral relationship, it is not in spite of our closeness, but because of it, that we must be frank about our concerns related to human rights. And though Egypt has made some progress, much work remains to be done on critical areas, including making sure that basic rights to peaceful expression and assembly are protected, that fair and transparent judicial processes are upheld, and unjustly detained political prisoners are released. And that's why earlier this fall, I, along with our Middle East Subcommittee Chair, Representative David Cicilline, led a number of members in calling on the administration to withhold the $300 million in security assistance conditioned on rights issues. And while in Egypt in November for COP27, I had the opportunity to meet with courageous Egyptian activists and family members of those detained. I heard firsthand about the difficulties faced by those civil society activists, journalists, lawyers, and students. Going forward, I will continue to advocate for our relationship with Egypt to stay true to both our interests and values, and call for the release of unjustly detained political prisoners like Ali Abed al-Fattah, Mohammed al-Bakr, and Mohammed Ibrahim, and others. So thank you for your work and for hosting this very important discussion.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rami Yacoub. I am the Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, also known as TIMEP. Before we start, I want to express my gratitude to our partners at POMED for hosting this event. Furthermore, I'd like to thank Chairman Meeks for his remarks, leadership, and dedication to accountability, democracy, and human rights. Also, special thanks to my friend, Tess McHenry, POMED's Executive Director, for her opening remarks. It is important for me to iterate that I echo her words. And while we are here today to discuss Egypt's record on anti-corruption and women's rights, it is paramount that we recognize that corruption, lack of accountability, and the dismal state of women and minority rights, and in the absence of an independent judicial system, all of these things culminate to a real nightmare in real humans' lives. Lives are lost. Activists, journalists, academics, and politicians get robbed of years of their lives. Women of all walks of life get treated as second-class citizens in all aspects of life. And the negative implications on the economy, domestic industries, and the wealth and income of all citizens and the nation are endless. People like activist and poet Ahmed Doma, who has already lost a decade of his life behind bars, remain in prison for daring to be outspoken and defiant of regime narrative. Prominent British Egyptian technologist and activist Abdel Fattah, who went on a near deadly dry hunger strike, is languishing in prison for validating accounts of abuse inside prisons. Academics and researchers have lost years of their lives as well in prison, like Patrick Zeki and Karim Anara, who, despite being freed from prison, are banned from traveling with no clear explanation as to how they got placed on these lists of travel ban or mechanisms to appeal. Women don't escape this injustice. In fact, in this rampant culture of impunity, this means that conditions for women in imprisonment are in many ways worse. Journalists like Sulefa Megdi, activists like Isra Abdel Fattah and Sana Saif, and many other women have lost years behind bars for no unjustifiable reason. The plague of widespread corruption has robbed Egypt from some of its finest minds and entrepreneurs. For example, just this past week, Dr. Mohammed Abdel, one of Egypt's finest investigative journalists, passed away in exile at the age of 34, unable to be reunited with extended family members and friends. Sadly, he is not the only one, and if things in Egypt don't change, won't be the last. As we are convening today, 2 members of the Thabit family, pioneers of the Egyptian dairy industry, are languishing in jail for resisting militarization of the economy. They are just one example of the many Egyptian businessmen who have been affected by this unhealthy regime intervention. These are only merely examples of how corruption and inequity truly manifests in the reality of millions. To better help us understand the underlying conditions and symptoms of corruption and the state of women's rights and gender issues in Egypt, I'm joined today by 2 phenomenal panelists. First, my friend Lubna Darwish, Gender and Human Rights Officer at the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, also known as EIPR. Lubna works on gender and sexuality with focus on criminalization. Second, my friend and colleague Tim Keldis. Tim is a policy fellow at TIMEP. He researches transitional politics in Egypt, regime survival strategies, and Egyptian political economy and foreign policy and beyond. After an initial round of questions, we will dedicate limited time to questions and answers from the audience. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom and be sure to indicate which question your panelist is directed, which panelist your questions are directed to. And with that said, I would actually like to start with asking Lubna a question. In 2017, the Egyptian government launched the National Strategy for the Empowerment of Women, with a vision that by 2030, Egyptian women will become active contributors to the achievement of sustainable development in the nation that guarantees the constitutional rights, ensure their full protection, etc. Can you talk to us about the current state of that effort, Lubna, and what, if any, improvements has the government made, and where is it falling short?
Sure. Thank you, Rami. I would like to follow the structure of the strategy, actually, just to get like a pan image on the situation of women in the country, especially in the last few years. So the Egyptian government likes all the time to present its steps when it comes to women's rights as a success story, and actually uses the so-called development in women's rights to kind of mask larger scale situation of human rights in the country. That's why, especially, I think it's very important to critically and honestly look at what's been done and what we have ahead to do, and the reality of such developments. So first of all, I'll give the government what it's owed in the place where, in actually the domain that did the biggest success, and that would be having women in leadership positions within the government and leadership positions within the parliament as well. But this has to be taken with a lot of care, dealt with a lot of care. So we've seen in the last few years, at some point we had 25% of the cabinet being ministers, women ministers, and that was something that never happened before. Now we're at 18% of the cabinet, the ministers being women, where the government likes to promote the presence of women in the parliament. And actually we have the highest number ever of women, percentage of women in the parliament in the last two, in the current parliament. But this has to be taken within a context where the political process and the democratic process that lead us to the parliament was, let me say, not perfect at the very least. In the meaning of, these are not women who are active in political parties, that are engaged in societies, or like, you know, kind of like build this presence within society politically and within their parties, and therefore made it to the parliament. And that would ensure an open door in for the future for women in political leadership. These were like kind of done within a not perfect democratic process. Therefore, it's kind of like a very vulnerable presence in the political sphere. The other place where the government has done very, very good steps is actually the presence, removing the glass ceiling, if we may say. So it did good steps in that direction. So for once, we have jobs that were prohibited before for women or conditioned for women. These kind of legal regulations were removed. And we've seen women in courts that usually for like decades refused to have women as judges. We're seeing women enter these spaces for the first time. So that's the good part. So the good part basically is very good internationally. It looks very good internationally when we meet that many ministers. We're seeing that presence in courts, and these are very good steps. But they do not touch the lives of most Egyptian women and girls because of their nature, because they're top tier kind of rights for specific people. But when you look at the larger, and we move to the next thing, the economic empowerment of women. And that's where we see the biggest discrepancy between what the government is saying publicly and what actually is happening on the ground. So the government likes to claim that actually women economically are doing very well in the country. And this is by governmental number and statistics as not true. The government likes to always highlight unemployment rates, especially since 2016. And this is very dishonest because when you look at employment and participation in the workforce for women, this has been increasing almost continuously since 2015 until now. And this is not simply, it goes back to mostly one factor, is that the economy is designed around mostly one sector that is not very welcoming to women and is not actually doesn't have very good quality jobs, which is the construction sector, which is not welcoming. Like the presence of women in that sector is almost like it's minimal, while it's basically the sectors that are shrinking down, like education and health, are actually usually the most employing of women with good jobs and good benefits. And we're seeing this kind of decline, not only, of course, in the public sector, because the public sector is shrinking, but also in the private sector, and the situation in the private sector is even worse. And the guarantees of women's rights in the private sector are not respected and enforced. The second thing that the government does on the level of women economic empowerment is actually microcredits and financial inclusion. And it looks like we're in sheer numbers. It looks like very good that we're having more women with bank accounts and that kind of like actually statements that government likes to do. But when you look at it, actually, these bank accounts are not linked with access to loans or access to credit lines or anything that would help women move forward. It's usually kind of like just a card. They're registered by a card to receive kind of like benefits from the government if they're under a program or another. And when it comes to microcredit, that's the only sector within employment of women that is actually advancing, but in a very, very unstable economic environment. So the government doesn't open the doors in how it structures the economy for women to be employed in safe jobs. What's happening is that as an afterthought, women are given the opportunities of microcredits in a very vulnerable situation. And we've seen the first hit and the moment of realization for us actually, and evaluation of the microcredit programs happened when COVID-19 hit. And we've seen people struggling to pay their loans. And once again, now that we're approaching another IMF deal and another step in the evaluation of the Egyptian pound, we'll see more women suffer to pay back these loans.
Yeah. Sorry, Lobna. I'm sorry if I'm interrupting you, but it's a great segue for my question for Tim, because now this is the overlap that a lot of people kind of divorce women's issues, women's rights, women's status in society, and kind of then talk about the economy separately. And as probably perhaps the audience knows well, and observers of Egypt has been doing, shall we say, subpar in the economic portfolio. And I'd like to actually bring Tim here and piggybacking on what Lobna was just saying about women's economic situation and how they're an afterthought. But Tim, let me ask you, the Egyptian military's prolific role in the economy over the last 8 years is the most recognized symptom of this grand corruption in the country, I feel. And they have also severely indebted the country in pursuit of what many call vanity projects. I want to ask you, in what way does this, again, relying on what Lubna was saying and also building on it, in what way does this impact everyday Egyptians, and how have these practices contributed to the overall economic crisis in the country?
Sure, thank you. I think, yeah, I think you've really focused on the primary concern that I have when it comes to this question of corruption. I think a lot of people think of it in terms of like backroom deals for like individual graft, and really what we need to think more about is the over leveraging of the state to enrich and strengthen and consolidate the power of regime elites. I think that's a really much more dramatic and worrying example of the corruption that I'm concerned about and focus on. So, I mean, for the last several years, basically, and I disaggregate the regime from the state here. So the regime being the constellation of powers that has captured the state and kind of rules the country, their interests do not coincide necessarily with the state. And what they've been doing for the last several years through the state is leveraging the state to take on a great deal of debt that then it gets transferred into debt-driven stimulus spending on a variety of, as you rightly put it, vanity projects. So like the new administrative capital, which is estimated to cost somewhere in the order of $50 to $60 billion, an array of infrastructure projects, new roads, new highways, new bridges. And it's not that all these things, not that some of these things aren't worthwhile. I mean, the new capital, I don't think so, but some of the projects are useful. Certainly Egypt's infrastructure requires upgrading. But the trouble is that what often happens is that these deals are, rather than put out there for competitive tenders to get the best offer for the state, they're filed to military-owned companies by direct order from the government. And the result is that the military basically gets to take a cut of the on top of the real cost of these projects, and then subcontract the execution of a lot of these projects to private firms. And there's a lot of, I mean, there's also a lot of concerns about how they're pricing these things and how accurately or they're doing so, or how much over the real cost they're taking. I've heard certainly stories of military officials telling contractors, look, we want you to charge this amount. We're going to pay you half of that, which is still more than you actually asked for, and then we're going to take the other half. And I mean, I'm not going to identify obviously the people involved in that because they're still in the country, but this is happening in the context of a state that is dealing with an enormous financial crisis. And it's financing, and it's taken on in the last 6 years since the IMF did its first bailout in 2016, over $100 billion of additional external debt. And in that time, poverty has risen. The private sector has contracted for virtually every single month since that deal was made. Last month, it contracted significantly, one of the worst months in the last 5 years, or in the last decade, I should say, sorry. And as Lubna correctly pointed out, this fixation on unemployment is completely unhelpful. Labor force participation has been in decline, especially for women, who have dropped from around 23% when this program began to below 15% today. And this dramatic decline in the standard of living for people has happened alongside this accumulation of all this external debt. So the problem is the state is overburdened. The state is spending more than its revenue to service and pay down this debt. And no normal Egyptian has benefited in 6 years. Quite the contrary, they're worse off. And they're about to get even worse off than they already were, because the new financial crisis that Egypt's facing is more worrying than the one they had in 2016. Because in 2016, their debt to GDP ratio was still relatively low. Their amount of external debt was relatively low. So they had runway. They had space to take on debt to try to get out of the hole they were in. But now they've already taken on an enormous amount of debt. They've spent 200% they're taking on over 200% of their quota with the IMF after this new loan is approved this month. And on top of that, the global monetary conditions are much tighter than they were in 2016. So the ability to borrow is harder and the cost of borrowing is higher. And so you have a state that's overburdened because the regime has been basically using it as a mechanism as a vehicle to enrich itself while ladening it with enormous amounts of debt. And on top of that, the aggressive expansion of the military in the economy has deterred any investment from private sector actors, both domestic and international, which has contributed to this failure to produce the jobs that Egyptians need. And the worst thing is, going forward, this debt-driven stimulus that has been the vehicle for growth for the last 6 years will no longer be a viable option, because the state cannot continue to borrow in the fashion that it had in the past, which was the mechanism through which it was able to pursue this stimulus. So the main vehicle for growth is at risk of collapse. The private sector is embattled because of the repression you cited with the Sabbath family, for example, because of the militarist expansion into every sector of the market, basically. And finally, because of extremely high interest rates that make borrowing to finance new investments in projects all the more burdensome. Not to mention that the credit market in Egypt is a mess. So for all these reasons, it's a very bleak and worrying picture going forward. And inflation is already at a 5-year high. Last month was 18.5%. And it's going to get worse, because that's barely pricing in the collapse in the pound that we've seen.
Great. Tim, thank you so much for this answer. And I think it puts things in context on a larger connecting. It's always important to connect what's happening on the 30,000 foot level with what's happening with the lives of the average Egyptian. I want to switch gears and step away from the economy for a moment and get back to Lubna and ask her a question about women's rights in general, but also things that hinder women's participation in just everyday life. And particularly, one of these things that happen both inside the working space and outside of it is sexual harassment. In 2021, the Egyptian Penal Code was amended to increase the penalties for those convicted of sexual harassment. I want to ask you, because that does relate also substantially to, again, it happens in everyday life for all Egyptian women, unfortunately, but particularly also in the working space as well. But what steps has the government and the judiciary taken towards enforcement of these provisions, and what obstacles still exist for women reporting gender-based violence, whether inside or outside of the working space?
So I'm very happy, Rami, that you mentioned the amendment of the sexual harassment code, articles within the penal code, because that's a typical example of how the government approaches women's rights in Egypt. Is that it uses mostly the tool of the law, of amending laws. And the only way it approaches law almost is actually to harshen sentences, thinking that deterrence in itself is going to be the only tool to provide women with safety in society, especially when it comes to sexual violence and FGM and similar issues. So, but while doing so, it doesn't do it because this usually gets like headlines internationally. It looks good. You can list it as like progress steps, but it does not really represent what's happening socially and on the ground. Not in the meaning of that we still have like high rates of sexual harassment, but also it does not reflect the experience of women and people working on women's rights and providing legal aid all the time. The sentences were not the obstacle. It's not that the sentences were too low, therefore people were taking it lightly. The sentences were already high, but the idea of criminalization as the only like high sentencing and like harsh sentencing as the only entry point to send social messages proves to be unusable in the meaning of, for example, the amendment you're referring to moved sexual harassment from a misdemeanor to a felony, which looks good, but in practice means that it's way longer time for investigation, way longer time in the prosecution, and way longer, almost months in courts, which means that this whole time a woman is under pressure by the defendant, his family, or like if they're powerful, especially if they're powerful, under pressure to drop the case, under pressure to kind of retaliation. And it creates a new problem instead of like actually solving older ones. For the longest time, people working on women's rights in Egypt and the country, and feminists and women in general have been speaking up as the experience of going to report sexual harassment in a police station is not a very good experience. That the first like struggle actually is to get your complaint in, and then to get to the prosecution, and then to get to court, and like the kind of like the judgments that the rulings of judges, and depends on like your background, on the story, on the circumstances of the sexual violence, and basically there is like, at least within that process, you're usually morally judged as someone going to, as a victim, instead of actually being supported as a victim. So the interventions are very focused on one tool, which is harshening of sentences, which does not lead into higher reporting rates. And for me at work, I always focus on reporting rates. Reporting rates are the way forward. It's not like it doesn't have to be that the defendant will stay in prison for 10 years for sexual harassment. The important thing that we have more and more women able to use the law when they need it to actually move on with their lives. And when it comes to, for example, sexual harassment workspace, this is something that's not dealt with specifically actually in the labor law. And even though there are like many opportunities and many calls from women's rights groups for actually the labor law to reflect the protection of protection of everyone actually from sexual violence workspace, this was never actually, even in the last bill, it's not reflected. So it shows you the theatrical, how theatrical is the government when it comes to interventions. And it doesn't have to be that it's in bad faith. Sometimes it's like, because it's not evidence-based, it's not evaluated, there's no social debate, there's no space for critically engaging with it, therefore you don't get the best results.
Yeah, no, that's spot on, Lubna. And actually, like, let me just follow up with another question, since we're dived into the harassment issue. Cyber violence is a distinct form of harassment used against Egyptian women. I mean, women at large around the world, but in the case of Egypt. And one study found that 41.6%, I believe, of women experience cyber violence in a year. Is the government doing anything to confront this disturbing trend, and how has civil society played a role in encouraging perhaps some reform, if there's space for that?
So online cyber violence is dealt with in the same way offline violence is dealt with, and therefore they are under the same legal tools. But I would like actually to move this question a bit on how the government is dealing with the cyberspace and place of women in cyberspace. So the internet has been one of the the only space left for people to organize, especially women. We've seen a lot of organizing in the last few years, for people to speak up. And women have been filling that space, women and girls have been filling that space with their positions, especially when it comes to sexual violence, because it's an issue that people have a lot to say about. And what we've seen the government do at the same time, instead of sending a message of protection of women on the internet as a priority, it started itself criminalizing women's presence on the internet. We've seen a pattern of criminalization of women's presence on the internet, or as social media influencers, like on TikTok. We've seen women being arrested simply because they're from less privileged backgrounds, and they're kind of cute and sexy on TikTok, but with nothing that's criminalized by law. Under, for example, the so-called crime of violation of family values, Egyptian family values, which is tells you a lot about the state's position on morality. And we've seen in the last 3 years, especially, an attack on women under the disguise of protection of morality, of the Egyptian family, and making the presence of women on the internet in itself questionable, or at least not safer. It does not send the message that the presence of women on the internet is something to be protected, that they can exist there and express their opinions and live their lives on the internet with safety. Instead, it added to the stigma, and it added to the how easily is it to attack women on the internet. Because this is in a context where the security services actually own the majority of newspapers and media outlets in the country. And these media outlets actually sometimes spearhead attacks on specific women, smear campaigns, without any consequences.
Yeah, it seems, I would assume that for an outsider's perspective, it would look like there is more focus on, at large, there's this, again, aside from the culture of impunity, but this attempt to project a certain image about Egypt and to make things look good, whether it be for women's rights, criminalization of certain behaviors, or in some cases, or a lot of cases, silencing independent voices and independent other different narratives that kind of do not fit within the moral, positive, economically, or positive societally. And I think I actually want to like focus on this point a little bit more and perhaps switch to Tim here. And I want to ask you, Tim, how does this lack of transparency when it comes to independent narratives affect the economy at large? I mean, we've seen some economists also languish and die in prison as of recent. And I want you to help us perhaps understand this better, and as to how this subduing of independent narratives affects the economy at large and other things.
Sure. I think it's really a vitally important issue. I think that the lack of access to information in Egypt makes it really challenging to make decisions about investing in Egypt, which is an issue that's gotten a little bit of attention. I mean, as Lubna pointed out, the vast majority of the press is controlled by the regime, either directly or indirectly. And so the reliability of information is certainly dubious. Even the Central Bank of Egypt has made knowingly false statements about the fact that the Egyptian pound is freely floating, as Tahrir Ahmed, the former central bank governor, kept insisting when we all knew that wasn't true. And these sorts of things result in a situation where investors, don't have any really reliable public sources of information from within Egypt. And so they depend on rumors, they depend on, private conversations that are, of course, of limited credibility and reliability. They hire risk investigators to try to get, little bits of information, but to make major decisions, it's very difficult. And then the flip side of that I think gets a lot less attention is consumers have no access to reliable information. And the result is that they're also making consumer decisions based on rumors, making decisions about whether or not to sell their Egyptian pounds to buy dollars based on rumors that the pound is about to collapse or is about to spike. And I mean, a talk show on a regime-affiliated channel with Yusuf Husseini was telling Egyptians, I have information, you better sell all your dollars and buy Egyptian pounds by September 15th. You better, make sure you get there in time, because otherwise you think something you're going to regret it. And so his implications to the public is that the pound is going to recover and the dollar will decline. Well, since then, the pound has completely collapsed, and whoever did follow that advice actually lost quite a lot of money, and will lose more, because the pound is almost certainly going to continue in that direction for quite some time at this rate. So it's not only that the regime is denying people access to information by blocking websites, by intimidating journalists, by imprisoning journalists, but also it's engaging in disinformation through the media channels it controls and misleading the public. And all of this undermines consumer confidence. It creates shocks that are unnecessary for the public. And it certainly deters investment. And then finally, frankly, the lack of transparency means that even governments don't really trust Egypt. The number of times I've had meetings with foreign officials asking, well, is this really true about something the Egyptian government has said? It's remarkable. And we do it with everything. We do it with security issues. We do it with medical issues, where we just don't want to disclose the facts because the government has this allergy to transparency. They have this idea that if we give information, that it will be somehow definitely used against us. But what they don't seem to recognize is by not having this credibility, by not having this transparency, it actually is very damaging for them, because then no one trusts anything they say. I mean, when there was a terrorist attack that took down the Metrojet in Sinai, normally when there's a terrorist attack, there's sympathy, there's support. But because the government didn't even acknowledge that it was a terrorist attack for months, when everybody knew it was, when ISIS published a video showing that it was, well, everyone canceled flights because no one believed that the government recognized the problem that existed to begin with. And then months later, the president casually mentions the terrorist attack, even though the whole time Egyptian officials were berating anyone who mentioned a terrorist attack because they hadn't waited for the results of the investigation, which, by the way, to this day has not been published. They keep saying, wait for the investigation, and we never get the publication of these investigations.
Just don't hold your breath on that one. Speaking of statements made by the Egyptian government, the government has repeatedly made public statements about their intent to list public and military-owned companies on the Egyptian Stock Exchange by the end of 2022. As both you and I and others have mentioned, the militarization of the economy is a huge factor in all of this. And so I want to ask you, what is the status of these supposed efforts, and why are they important to facilitate a more sustainable economic model? And how did the military come to own a broad array of public sector assets, if you will?
Sure. I think, well, I actually would start by saying I'm not so sure that even if they did manage to do this, that it would necessarily be that beneficial. And the reason for that is simple. The idea, so this started in 2018. The president was talking and he's saying, there was more scrutiny and pressure over the military's expansive role in the economy and their growing number of businesses, both internationally and even amongst the Egyptian public. There was a lot of people taking notice that, while everyone is going through austerity, the military seems to be flush with cash. And so President Sisi was saying, well, I don't see any reason why not that the rest of you can't benefit with us, and you should invest with us and we can grow together. And that's where this started, as kind of as a way to kind of dampen the criticism and pressure over this issue. And as you pointed out, we've been hearing about this forever and it hasn't happened. Well, here's the thing. Hypothetically, should they list those companies? The difference between a regime-owned enterprise, like something owned by the military, and a state-owned enterprise in the classical sense, is that the state has no claim to the value of that company, to its profits, to its assets, to anything. So in the event that the military were to list its company on a stock exchange or sell equity in its company to a private investor, the military would keep that money. It wouldn't improve the solvency of the state. It wouldn't contribute to its ability to pay off its bills. It wouldn't strengthen its ability to borrow further. It wouldn't have any positive impact on the finances of the Egyptian state. It would, in fact, give more capital to the military that it could then reinvest in expanding its economic empire while retaining control of companies that it sold equity in. So it's actually a fundraising activity for raising capital in the way that it's currently modeled. And so while everyone is hoping that this would mean the military reining in its role in the economy, it's not clear that that's the case at all. And when pressed, both the planning minister and the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund made clear that this is not really about reducing the military's role in the economy. It's about repositioning and rationalizing its role in the economy in some way. And so this isn't really a very promising thing for Egypt. It is important that the military actually start to withdraw from the economy. That would be really significant. The main benefit potentially of listing these companies on the stock exchange is that, in theory, they would be required to disclose their finances, because you can't evaluate the value of a company without knowing its liabilities, its revenue, its profits, et cetera, the assets it possesses, which is obviously not available at this time. It's a constitutionally protected national security secret, the finances of the Egyptian military. And so we have no clear picture of that. And that's not only a problem because of not knowing the scale of their engagement or how much they're avoiding taxes, because they're not subject to VAT, they're not subject to customs, they're not subject to corporate taxes, et cetera. It's also a really important issue because we don't know how much debt they hold. And this is a major risk issue that has been identified by the State Department, that has been identified by a number of people looking at Egypt, is we know how much debt the state has, which is already worrying. But there are all these companies that are not technically state-owned enterprises, that are not private firms, really. They're attached tangentially to the state, who are pursuing all these projects that in theory might involve borrowing from state banks. And we have no idea how much they borrowed and how much they owe and how healthy their cash flow is. And it's very likely that in the event that their cash flow were to come under strain and their ability to service their debt was compromised, that they would try to move that debt back into the state's burden. And that's worrying. And that's a pile of risk that no one can properly evaluate because of the secrecy around state finances. I didn't answer your question about how they got to this point. I don't, if you.
Maybe very quickly, because I want to get back to Lubna, but please do, because it's an important question to be answered.
Sure. I mean, it started back in the 70s, when after Egypt, finished its wars with Israel, and the idea was that the military needed to reduce its spending. And so a way to offset the fact that they were cutting spending to the officer corps was to give them a different way to make money. And that was move them into the private sector. However, since the overthrow of Mubarak and the coup d'etat, it's become a mechanism for the military not only to build up a patronage network, but actually to control the distribution of wealth in the country, so that the center of power under Mubarak, the civilian business elite that was tied to the regime, can no longer kind of independently accumulate wealth without working in coordination with the military and under the military, you know, in a dependent role. And so they're not just, people think it's just about making money sometimes. It's really also about controlling the distribution of capital in the country in a way that allows them to consolidate power and prevent anyone from being able to accumulate this independent source of power potentially without having a dependent relationship and a positive relationship with the regime and its entities.
Thank you, Tim, for summarizing that as succinctly as possible. I have a question for both of you, but I'd like to start with Lubna on that one. Considering our audience and the position where POMED and TIMEP are, I want to ask you, Lubna, can you offer some concrete policy recommendations for countries like the U.S. when they're engaging with Egyptian government, or other Western global North countries, I suppose, that have either behind closed doors conversations with Egyptian counterparts, what have you. But for particularly the U.S. now, during and following the summit, the Africa Summit, obviously, on these core issues that you were speaking about today, and the broader rights situation in the country. I'd like for you, Lubna, if you can give us your thoughts here, and then we'll turn over to Tim as well.
I would say, generally, anybody who gets this chance to discuss with the government human rights conditions in the country, especially as this is my most interest, not to allow women's rights to be used for washing the regime, basically, and its reputation, because not only is this like in itself very harmful to most Egyptians, but because the situation of women's rights is not good at all. I mean, we've seen not only haven't we seen enough development in some aspects, but we've seen things that we've never seen before. We've seen steps back. Like, I mean, the attack on morality, the attempt at like policing women's personal lives and public image. We haven't seen that much. I mean, that's like a new thing. That level of interest from the government in policing of morality, that's a new step further. So not to allow this to happen, but also to be evidence-based, because part of the problem is that the government uses strategies, for example, that it launched. Launching a strategy is one thing, and evaluation of strategies and actually getting to numbers and facts and actually investigating this and asking for, especially in projects where there is like partnerships and cooperation and funding of projects related to women, especially, to ask for interim reviews, to ask for reporting, to ask for evidence-based that these strategies actually do work. And I would take a step further to say that to make sure that cooperations and projects, even development projects, are not in themselves committing human rights violations. And I would point here to the Economic Court. The Economic Court, which was funded with a lot of support, was like actually founded with a lot of support from the EU and US, actually ended up being one of the tools that the government is using to criminalize women. We got to the point, not only women, gay men, men who have sex with men, religious minorities. We've ended up that this court is in charge of making sure that people do not violate family values, Egyptian family values. So to make sure, it's very hard to be a partnership in development projects, I'm talking here, with a government that has consistently violates human rights without actually ended up being partners in these violations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you brought the Economic Court up, because I was also used to accuse women on TikTok for, with what was it? I believe like human trafficking through the Economic Court as well. Yeah, which is really bizarre, to say the least. Tim, same question to you. What recommendations, concrete policy recommendations for the U.S. During its engagement with Egypt, privately or during the summit? We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, to echo Lubna, really focusing on, particularly on where the partnerships are and making sure that they're not actually contributing to the deteriorating situation even further, I think is vitally important. And this requires coordination. I think one of the fundamental problems with a lot of Western engagement in Egypt is how dissociated different pieces of engagement are. So, for example, the European Commission withheld some money over human rights violations while the major powers in the EU were guaranteeing loans of tens of billions of dollars to Egypt, which really kind of erased the significance of the European Commission's position. And this kind of lack of coordination is really important. I mean, Egypt has put in orders with the French government between 2012 and 2021 for arms, nearly as much as the entire EU combined. It's a remarkable thing. This is from a French parliamentary report. So the reality is that if out of one side of your mouth you're saying human rights, democracy, pluralism, accountability, governance, which are all important things, and at the same time you're giving the Egyptian government kind of extraordinary access to credit and basically fueling, if not accelerating, the indebting of the state in this corrupt fashion that is doing untold damage to not only the Egyptian public's interests, but also the sustainability and stability of the Egyptian state in a way that kind of flies in the face of the official justification for supporting the regime, which is basically, I mean, whether or not they admit it, the authoritarian stability theory. They believe that Sisi delivers some form of stability, and that in the context of the region's difficulties, that's preferable, which I disagree with. But also, they're subsidizing a variety of activities that undermine that goal, even if that was their only goal. So, being much more deliberate about the conditionality on the assistance that you're providing, being much more comprehensive about all the different bodies you're a part of. So, if you're a shareholder and the IMF and the EBRD are giving Egypt collectively over $30 billion, and then you're saying, I'm going to withhold, $200 million. Well, the Egyptian officials are going to look at that and be like, how serious are you about human rights, right? I think that's a really fundamental problem. And this is true with the United States' $200 million and then approving a $2.5 billion arms purchase almost immediately afterwards. There needs to be coherence. There needs to be consistency. And Egyptian officials, frankly, they need to be spoken to in a transparent way in which it's a clear transactional relationship where we need to see X, Y, and Z before you will see, the things that you're after. And it's just about, it's not even about, bullying or anything like that. If you're going to give money, if you're going to play a role in what happens in Egypt, you're responsible for making sure that role doesn't hurt the Egyptian public. That's really what I'm talking about. The Egyptian regime is not entitled to international financing. It is not entitled to assistance. And if that assistance is only helping the regime while the public's standard of living is in decline, while women's rights are being trampled, while the public's rights are being trampled, well then, what are you really financing? And so this is a serious issue. I mean, Egypt's taken on all of this debt. The public is worse off. Women are worse off. The state is worse off. And it's just this group of elites who have kind of put the whole country in this extraordinarily precarious situation, who are the only beneficiaries. And frankly, they've gone so far that they're probably damaging their own longevity and interests at the rate they're going. And they really need to rein it in. And you can see that there's internal disputes as a result of that in recent months.
Right. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim, for that. And thank you both. I would like to actually start taking some questions from the audience. We have quite a bit of them, and we are short on time. Obviously, these two topics are impossible to cover entirely in the limited time that we have, but we'll do our best. I'm going to start with one question, and forgive me, I'm going to refrain from mentioning names of people that are asking the questions just for the sake of time. There's a question for Lubna. This person's thanking you, obviously, for your talk today, and then they are saying there was a law a couple of years ago during the Fairmont Hotel case that women could report sexual harassment and other violence against women anonymously. Is that work, or is that still in practice? Is that still possible? And just before Lubna, you answer, I just want to give a context to the audience who do not know about the Fairmont case. It was a very high-profile rape case. And Lubna, if you want to share a little bit more about that and tell us if that's actually practiced or not.
Thank you for that question, because it's actually, again, is a perfect example. So there was, in 2020, we had almost like 6 months of an upheaval of testimonies of women against sexual violence, big cases, anonymous testimonies coming out, a lot of solidarity, feminist solidarity taking place, leading to some of the cases being investigated. So in the Fairmont cases, special case, I'm not going to go in details, but basically a rape case that ended up, actually, we ended up with not all of the defendants arrested, but actually the witnesses in support of the victim and potential victims were actually arrested as well, and were like at some point facing charges and stayed in jail in pretrial detention for a while till they were acquitted when the case was dropped against the defendants, who are from very, very powerful. The defendants were from very powerful families in Egypt. So basically, at this time, there was an amendment of a legal article that was supposed to give protection of women's anonymity when they report sexual violence. And this is a typical example. So I was telling you about how every legal intervention of the government when it comes to defend to citizens and crimes is to harshen the sentences. So here the case was that a public employee and anybody working within the Ministry of Interior or later on the prosecution or in courts cannot release the name of the defendant, of the victim. And this is, you'd find that this amendment is the only one that doesn't have any penalties. So it says that it's illegal to release the information, but there is no penalty. And at the same time, as this code was being amended, at the same time, media outlets all over the place was actually releasing investigation. We're not talking about like simply names or photos or like they were releasing personal photos, very intimate leaked photos or videos, or like some of them doctors, some of them are true, and even like line by line investigation documents from the prosecution and from the police stations. So it looks good. It looks like we're protecting victims, but in practice, it's not done in a way that would protect anybody. And at the same time, you're leaving the violations to take place without any accountability. I mean, at the time of Fairmont, we've seen things we haven't seen before. We've seen very, very private photos and videos being released of victims and witnesses, which led to actually a retreat in this. I was telling you about this kind of like upheaval of testimonies, a retreat in this, because everybody was aware that if I'm not the perfect victim, if I'm not the perfect witness in the meaning of my morality as judged by the prosecution or the policeman, I may end up actually the one in jail.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, and the concept of perfect victim. And correct me if I'm wrong, Lumna, but the perfect victim here would be a woman that falls under the premise of what is seen to be moral, perhaps a heterosexual woman that does not engage in anything that is not seen by the Egyptian family values to be improper or wrong, and then this person has to be subjected to a certain violation that is so grave, and then henceforth becomes the perfect victim. Thank you for that, Lubna, and thank you for going through this, that explanation. There's another question here to both speakers, but let's just start with Tim on that one. And again, this is the perception of the person asking. I don't necessarily agree with this opinion, but just out of transparency here. This person is asking, previously it seems like Egypt cared about its international image more, but during COP27, the person says, I got the impression that Egypt cares less about that image. Is it more and more okay to be a human rights bully? I guess that's the person. And do you agree with that? If yes, what consequences would it have?
Sure. I think the reality is that Egypt's concern about its international image has kind of ebbed and flowed over the years. There have been times where it seemed very concerned about it, and other times where it's kind of fought back against criticism. We saw, so right after the coup, it was very averse to any sort of criticism and wasn't willing to tolerate it, basically. Then kind of as things calmed down and its bilateral relations started to strengthen, we started to see kind of a softer argument from the regime. And then I would say around the time of the Arab League European Union Summit, we see a reversion back to, we have different cultures, we have different values, you're not in the position to lecture us, and that's it. And Egypt's kind of stuck to that ever since, I would say. I mean, it was interesting in that brief interim when there was some, engagement with the criticism. I remember President Sisi was in Paris on a state visit, not this last one, but the one before, and he had a press conference with Macron, and he was getting, critical questions about human rights in Egypt, as you'd expect, and they were mostly focused on political rights. And he's like, well, there are other human rights. I mean, why aren't you asking me about education and healthcare? We also aren't able to deliver those. And then he used that as a segue into, look, Egypt's at the beginning of this very long path, and hopefully in time we'll reach this point where we can deliver all of the things that you're describing, but we're not there yet. And that was an argument that had a lot of traction in Western audiences. It's like we're working on it. We got a lot of issues to deal with, and it's not going to be perfect. But they transitioned away from that to, this is none of your business, basically. And they've really stuck to that ever since. And I think COP definitely showed the extent to which they care, to the extent that they get mad when they get criticized, but they don't seem to care to the extent that they're willing to do the things that could prevent them from being criticized. I mean, they really went out of their way at COP to display the extent of repression and their disregard for concerns about it. They harassed human rights defenders at the event. They engaged in extremely intrusive surveillance of participants. They loaded the official application with an array of spyware. The German delegation, the German government had to complain to the UN about the amount of surveillance being used on its pavilion. And Germany is, one of Egypt's most important partners. It's provocative, right? And why? The regime didn't benefit from doing any of that. It just drew attention to the fact that all the criticisms that it's been getting were entirely justified, and it's much worse than most people realize. And they did that to an audience that might not have really been fully aware of the scale of the problem before. And a massive international audience, tens of thousands of people attending this event. So it really does put on display the extent to which they seem to cease to care, except to complain about it. And really are the ones doing their worst PR for themselves. I mean, the people that they hire to try to make them look good, they have no chance of succeeding because the regime goes out of its way to undermine them.
Yeah, it's a tough battle for whoever's running that PR.
Rami, sorry, can I jump in to add to
yes,
the
please,
the
exactly.
answer?
Yes. I was about to say.
Sorry. I think Egypt cares about its international reputation when it comes to human rights as much as its partners care, really. If you're having a partnership where you really care about human rights, the government will actually put this as a priority. If it's lip service, it will not care because it knows it will not impact anything. So basically, I think reputation, that's how it works. One cares as much as it actually impacts its future, it impacts its situation.
That's a very important distinction. Yeah, it's a great distinction and a great segue to just say simply, also echoing what Tim was saying, is that we need to, if you don't condition things or if you don't express that you really care about certain issues, why would the recipient party that is inflicting that pain on people care in the first place? Lubna, I want to switch gears here. There's a question I think is suited for you here, and the question reads: what recommendations do you have to combat the use of morality laws to persecute non-gender conformity? Are morality laws being abused more against women and LGBTQI plus persons than, for example, cybercrime laws to limit FOE?
So definitely any morality code article in the law, and there are many actually, whether the penal code or special laws, is being used against women, LGBT individuals way more than anybody else. I would add to this religious minorities and descendants in general. because they get like altered and used in different ways. So definitely, when we talk about family values, apparently family values means that the policing of women and LGBT individuals and people not conforming to a binary as well. So I have many recommendations. I mean, first of all, I would say that the public prosecutor would stop using this legal article to go after women and LGBT individuals. When we didn't go in actually to talk about specific human rights violations when it comes to the LGBT community, and we can go in a different context more in depth into that. But plenty of recommendations done by human rights organizations, including the IPR, of course, that targets exactly how can the government, how can we protect human rights for different groups, especially when it comes to the LGBT community and to women. But simply, in many cases, is simply for the government, first of all, to stop prosecuting these individuals and these groups and go after them with charges, but as well to listen. One of the main, we end up repeating this all the time, that the government has to be in conversation actually with civil society. It has to be in conversation with academics, with the people themselves who are concerned with these violations. Without conversation, even when the government is trying to protect women's right to, for example, for security, so to safety, ends up actually hindering these rights because it does not listen to experts, does not listen to people with experience on these levels. I hope this answers it.
It absolutely, certainly does. I want to switch gears a little bit here and ask you, Tim, one question from the audience here. How would you evaluate Egypt's political will to enact anti-corruption reform? What factors can explain that?
I think it really depends on what kind of anti-corruption reform we're talking about. I think on lower level, or I would say mid-level corruption, there have been crackdowns on that. But on the more grandiose scale of corruption that we were talking about earlier, that frankly is far more significant and far more consequential for the general public and for the state. The people who would be in the position to crack down on are the people who are orchestrating it and benefiting from it. So there's really no will at this time. What I would say is that I think that there's some disagreement within the regime about reining it in a bit, because I think that some people seem to have come to understand that it's unsustainable the way that the regime's been conducting itself and has been leveraging the state to enrich regime officials. And you see various breaks in the regime that indicate that, right? So we see members of parliament criticizing the spending priorities of the government. And what they're criticizing are the mega projects, the vanity projects, the enormous amounts of spending on infrastructure projects in a context of growing levels of poverty and hardship. And what they're really criticizing, they say the government, but indirectly they're criticizing the president because those are his priorities. That wouldn't happen without some fairly powerful groups permitting it to happen, I think. In the case of parliament, we're seeing on Amr Adib's show, an economist being allowed to lay out a very dire picture for how difficult Egypt's economic situation is. Amr Adib's show, for those who don't know, is the most widely watched talk show in the country, and certainly nothing's getting said on there without getting somebody's approval. We saw Mohammed Anwar Sadat issue a statement applauding the president's work so far and asking him to wrap it up at the end of his term and not run for another term in office. And that really raises questions about where did that come from? And I think who signaled that would be a safe thing to say? And that's my suspicion. And so what we have is a situation where there's tension at higher levels of power that really raise questions about what the negotiations looks like inside. I think so far they haven't agreed to rein things in, which is a part of the reason why the IMF loan to Egypt was so tiny. $3 billion over 46 months for a $400 billion economy is just, it's a symbolic act for the IMF to avoid saying we've given up completely. But the indications are that they wanted the military to be reined in terms of its economic activity. And it seems that at this time, that concession wasn't on the table. And so the size of the loan reflected that. Now the IMF, has a lot of responsibility for where we're at right now too. We can get into that later, but yeah, to answer the question, I think that the appetite so far isn't there in terms of the grant stuff, but it's a conversation that I think is also happening because they're being forced to have it because they're in a totally unsustainable position.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to ask Lubna one last question from the audience, and then we're probably going to have to wrap it up, unfortunately. So, because Lubna, you spoke about this earlier with regards to funds, projects, joint projects and whatnot. So one of the audience members is asking, how do you see the role of donors such as USAID in supporting anti-corruption reform in Egypt? You can take it whichever direction you want.
Yeah, I think the main thing is to ensure that in partnership, I mean, because human rights violations are actually now part of the daily life and the normal functioning of the government in all its branches. So, for example, you can get, you can think that even a partnership with the Ministry of Education would be a safe kind of way not to become like kind of partners in human rights violations, but you may end up having the Ministry of Education, which like just happened a few months ago, pioneering a new campaign to advocate against homosexualities in schools. So basically helping and creating kind of feeding into actually the incitement against LGBT individuals. So it's important to understand that it's very hard to have a partnership on development level with a government that is so used to human rights violations that it's actually kind of, it's not only something that it decides, it's the functioning, it's the daily functioning of the system. And therefore it has to be very, very clear that human rights are a priority to be protected in these partnerships, even on the level of USAID. So it has to be integral part of the general policy of funding or partnerships or whatever is the context.
That's great, Lubna. Thank you so much. With 1 minute left, I'm going to read one comment that was in the Q&A section again, refraining from names. One of our audience said, "Thank you so much for your collective insight and time. This was one of the best webinars on Egypt I've heard in a long time. Kudos to you all, and please keep up the important work despite all the obstacles." I'd like to echo these words to both of you. And I want to thank our audience, and I want to thank POMED and our crew at TIMEP for hosting this event. Thank you all so much, and please forgive me for audience members that had questions in the Q&A that we didn't get a chance to answer. And thank you all again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. It was great participating.
Thank you.
Lovely to be working with you over that.
Take care.
It's a pleasure.
Bye.